This is a wonderful segue into a keynote dialogue with two special women. Liz Carlisle is a current assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of several books, and she's working on her third book, and maybe she will talk humbly about a little bit about this book today. And then Aubrey Streit Krug, she's a writer and teacher and researcher, and studies the stories of relationships between humans and plants. She directs the Ecosphere Studies program at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. It's really an honor to have you both here, and I thank you wholeheartedly for your special note, your keynote today, and the keynote dialogue with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana. It's really an honor to be here. I'm really glad to be here with you all, and really looking forward to hearing from all the speakers today about your work, and to come together around grain and community. It's a huge honor to be in dialogue with Aubrey. I'm a little bit nervous, so I think that means I should probably just get started. So I'm going to start with an opening question for Aubrey. You grew up in the little town of Tipton, Kansas, where your family farms wheat and raises cattle. And you work at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, which is focused on developing an agriculture that better mimics the ecological structure of the prairie, specifically by breeding new grain crops that are perennial rather than annual. And it strikes me that breeding new grain crops, as you and your colleagues are doing at the Land Institute, has become extremely specialized work in the United States, something that a handful of scientists would typically carry out alone. And then, of course, farming grains is also done by a pretty small handful of folks in this country. One farmer can plant and harvest thousands and thousands of acres by themselves. But one of the major goals of the program that you direct at the Land Institute, Ecosphere Studies, is to invite many, many more people into the conversation and the work of selecting and caring for grains. So I wanted to kick off this conversation with you about grains and community by just asking this really basic question: why do grains require community?
I got myself unmuted and I'm ready to speak now. Hi, Liz, and hi, everybody. And Liz, thanks for starting with that really basic question. I think it's a great cornerstone. And the cornerstone of the answer is that, well, humans eat grains and humans have evolved to live in communities. So grains require community because they go together. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for us to talk about humans as self-made individuals. We're really social creatures who need and depend upon each other in land communities. I mean, even right now, I'm here because of my family who's watching my kid and who raised me. I'm here because of all of my colleagues and collaborators at the Land Institute. I'm here because of all of you and the work that you're doing. I'm here because of the Kaw people who have cared for this land that's sustaining me now, and the waffles I ate for breakfast and the air I'm breathing because of the plants around me here in this ecosphere. So, I mean, all of that reminder of community, I think, is always important for us. And in the long view, if we're thinking specifically about, grain crops, and the long view of human history, grains have always required communities and generations of people to select and grow and thresh and harvest and process and trade and consume them. And it's only kind of relatively recently in our ecospheric history, with the availability of some highly dense energy, that humans have been able to kind of decouple the work of farming grains from human communities. And, in that long view, as you mentioned, grains have been and still are mostly annual plants, and the Land Institute is interested in bringing perennial grain crops that can hold soil and have other ecological benefits and that can feed people into these current food systems. So I think with doing this work of creating new perennial grain crops, we have this really wonderful opportunity to think creatively about how we do that. because we want to bring these new perennial grain crops to scale quickly, but we also want to do that equitably in ways that can really sustain them for the long term. And that helps us grapple with the truth that domestication and creating and intending crops is not just a one-time event. It's this ongoing process of relationship. Arguably, we're still domesticating all of the crops and grains that we're working with now, as well as new crops that sort of as a species. We're continually engaged in those relationships every time we farm and eat. And those relationships have become, as you pointed out, way more kind of narrow and brittle and not accessible. And so as we think about creating systems of relationship that are more accessible, that are more robust, that welcome many, many points of interaction and many people, we can create these relational ties that might be able to endure for a long time. So when we're thinking about working with these new perennial grain crops, we're interested in kind of recognizing the cultural drivers that go into this change and really noticing them, the culinary significance, the cultural uses, and creating those kind of communities of people, not only, after the crops are domesticated, but really recognizing we need them to start and continue and then maintain these relationships of domestication. So we need new communities of perennial grain domesticators, growers, eaters, for intermediate wheatgrass, kernza perennial grain, for Silphium integrifolium, a perennial oilseed, for a legume or many legumes, sainfoin is a perennial grain legume. So there's lots of great models of how to do this in terms of participatory research and breeding extension. And I'm especially interested in this kind of civic science, citizen science type of model, where we can really think about how do we co-create and co-produce this change with people and plants and with science and community and story, and how can we create communities that support and relate to these grains that are really inclusive. So we can speak more about all of this, but in turn, I want to ask you a question to build upon this idea a little bit. So Liz, just to recap, you grew up not in Kansas, in Western Montana, and you now teach and research and collaborate and garden from a home base at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And in your writing, including the books that were mentioned earlier, Lentil Underground and Grain by Grain, you do this work I was just talking about. You explore how farmers and communities and food systems can make a just transition to sustainability and change for the better. And the stories that you find and tell have inspired my work in ecosphere studies, because in these stories, people are coming together to work for agricultural change. And there's physical labor, of course, in that work. And there's also social and emotional and political effort. It's all hard work. And it can be really rewarding and fun and life-giving work pursued in these relationships with other people and the land and plants and animals. And I want to invite you to speak about the power and role of grains in these communities of change. How do grains in particular feed this kind of just and transformative relationship?
Yeah, I think, kind of just going back to when I first started meeting farmers in Montana who were trying to convert to more ecological farming systems that didn't rely on this really dense energy, as you're saying, on fossil fuels and chemically based fertilizer and herbicide, largely for economic reasons, just seeing that commodity grain was going to bankrupt their farm and disconnect them from land that was central to who they were. Even though the people I was working with weren't indigenous to the place where they were farming, their families had been there for multiple generations. And I think they had a sense that they wouldn't be whole without a connection to land. And so it was really, I think in the 1980s, it was a moment of crisis for many grain farmers to feel like the very things that made them whole, connection to place, being in the same place that their ancestors lived and died, even if it wasn't thousands of generations back, but some connection to something larger than themselves was potentially going to be ruptured by the fact that the commodity grain economy did not honor those relationships, that they didn't honor their reciprocal obligations that they had with the kinds of prices they would get paid and what they would then end up paying for fertilizer or herbicide with these spikes in global prices of fossil fuel. So, when first talking with farmers in Montana who were trying to get out of that commodity trap by moving to something that mimicked nature, that saw the land as a teacher, that was more ecological, people were really trying to learn from, I think, the ecosystems around them and also from indigenous people in that place, but also in other places, with how can you put communities of plants together in ways that then don't require these external inputs that are too expensive and also have these environmental implications. And I think what was interesting to watch as I was in dialogue with folks about this and as they were developing their systems and telling me their stories about how this all played out, is the way in which I think they kind of learned from those plant communities about the need to collaborate. So these had been systems that were typically just wheat and barley, at least for the past generation, because people had kind of been pushed to a single commodity. And people were adding in pulse crops, legumes, lentils, also cover crops that were leguminous or these mixes. And they were noticing how legumes behave. Essentially, they were noticing that their lentil crop, for example, was pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that was part of its own growth. But then also, there was something that it was sort of sharing in the rhizosphere with the whole plant community that then had a relationship to their wheat crop thriving or other crops thriving or the land feeling different. People would talk about it being softer underfoot. And I think that, in a sense, kind of inspired people to rekindle memories of how human community could be that way without the constraints of this commodity economy that was kind of pushing people into this more individualistic mode of economy. And so people recovered these kind of memories of like, oh yeah, we've done barn raisings around here before. We have a history of mutual aid. We have a history of getting together in cooperatives. We developed a farmers union. We still have it. I think I went to that camp as a kid. And so I think that to me, there's some beautiful ways in which, land can be a teacher and plants can be a teacher. And people can kind of remember that we're the younger siblings, as I've heard, a number of Indigenous teachers talk about, that can learn from, whether you're thinking about it from an Indigenous creation story perspective or an evolutionary perspective, we can learn from the beings that have been successful on this earth longer than we have. And that, in a sense, allowed us to live, the teachers of the bacteria in our stomach. And so I think also, growing grain, these seeds, farmers have spoken to me really powerfully about how they connect us to something much larger than ourselves. They connect us to, generations and generations of people who saved those seeds before us. And then they also connect us to the possibility of a future of the generations and generations of people who might plant and eat and share, and sing over those seeds. So I think, compared to other kinds of rural economic development that I engaged with when I was working in a Senate office, there was something very visceral and something very embodied about grain as something to come together in community around.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And I want to ask a follow-up question quick, if that's okay. And I mean, I think it's really important to reconnect with these and remember these past traditions and across many different cultural backgrounds and context. But I also want to recognize there are harmful aspects of some of these past histories and traditions. So how do we reweave communities, especially with grains, and choose what good things we want to remember and reweave and carry forward, but then also avoid repeating some of the harmful aspects of economic and cultural systems customs and traditions. How have you seen communities do that sort of work?
I think that's a really important question. And I don't know that I have the answer to it yet. I think that's a question I feel like I'm asking in conversation as well. This sort of process of discernment, of looking at these strands that are intertwined, of really, for example, like a really beautiful food tradition and something that you might have a lot of like nostalgia over, and then recognizing that the development of that very particular variety also is intertwined with the history of colonization and violence. I think that our lives are full of those intertwinings that can be really difficult to figure out how to have discernment around. And I think that the first step is this honesty, that pushing away the parts of those intertwined histories that are uncomfortable or that we don't want to carry forward. We're going to carry it forward if we don't acknowledge it. So I think it starts with curiosity of really wanting to see what is there and what histories are in the land around us and the plants around us. And that seems like a starting point to try to figure out how to move forward. And I think, also creating more democratic structures for making these kinds of decisions and having these conversations. I think that's a huge issue with how grain is structured right now, how our experience of grain is structured, is that we really have a small handful of decision makers that have really undue influence, whether you're talking about the concentration of grain processing or land ownership, or the whole financial industry that structures how people can participate in these things. I think that's an area where we need a lot of structural change in order to make it possible to have a conversation where everybody really has a sort of an equal seat at the table. But I'm also actually something I'm really curious about that I haven't dug into very much, but that you have done a lot of really, really insightful work around, is the possibility of civic science. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about that model, specifically for grain, and why that's been such a compelling direction for you, what possibility you see there.
Yes, definitely. The travails of Zoom. I really like this civic science approach, and I understand it as a kind of experimental method. And it really aligns with what you were just speaking about, this need for trying to experiment with new ways to democratize and make more accessible the types of processes that are creating knowledge, and the types of people and places that have access to those methods of knowledge production and creation. So when we take a civic science approach to working with a perennial grain crop, we bring as researchers some scientific questions and needs for collecting data across multiple growing environments, sometimes novel growing environments, and understanding how plants are working or responding to places they may never have grown before. But we also bring a curiosity and a desire to learn more about people's individual experiences, their firsthand experiences repeatedly with interacting with new plants in their backyards and community gardens, and the questions they get from their neighbors and their own interests and observations. And so that hearing and making a space and a structure for them to make those relationships and tell those stories is really, I think, valuable and important, and creates that kind of cultural awareness and also raises new questions. I mean, in a perennial grain civic science project, where we have dozens of people around the U.S. growing this plant, we're sort of learning how to do the method. It needs to be grown more, but we've already uncovered a lot of things that we didn't think about to ask before, and that will help us shape the way that these processes going forward. So maybe to give a particular example, one of the projects that we're working on is a civic science approach to understanding Silphium integrifolium, which is a native perennial prairie plant that the Land Institute is domesticating as a future oilseed crop. And through this process of thinking about how to shape a civic science community, we've become a lot more attentive and attuned to the historical and contemporary relationships that Indigenous people have to this native prairie plant, and thinking about how to create and invest in long-term relationships and in understanding what already exists, and thinking about how to weave that together into this process. So we need to, I think, create these entry points where we can build those relationships and tend to them, and also start to recognize the work of care that everyone has been putting into and is putting into these processes going forward. So this idea that care is work, we often talk about care in just emotional terms, but it's also physical and ethical. And I think we should pay attention to who's doing that work that goes undervalued, that is often unnoticed. These plants are doing work, and a lot of people are doing work in contemporary systems, and we should think about ways that we can distribute that work more fairly and actually value it. And I think that that's how we can create and sustain a movement that can endure, and relationships that with these new crops and with grains that can endure for the long term. I want to ask you about this long-term work, because one word that has come up repeatedly in our conversations, and I think in this community and in many others, is this idea of health and healing, and creating relationships that endure for the long term. Is often about thinking about moving towards wholeness and healing. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about how you might define or understand this. I mean, what does working towards health or healing mean or look like?
This is great, because in our prep, I actually was like, Aubrey, I think I might ask you about healing. And she's totally turned it on me, which is the sign of a great friend. Who keeps you honest. Yeah, I think, I'm just struck by the fact that healing has already come into our conversation today. I heard Nana use that word. I heard Andy use that word in the context of some of the most challenging things that we're experiencing right now. Violence, really immediate violence. And for the community that's gathered here, so many people from Colorado have just experienced really horrific violence that's really difficult to make sense of. Healing feels like the word to bring into that space where you're not sure what words to use. Sometimes that's the first word that comes in that space that's before putting things in too much of a box in a really intellectual way. I think healing comes from a place that we're bringing our heart, we're bringing our soul. In some ways, we're invoking wisdom that's not even from us, but that we have access to through our relationships and through listening deeply to the teachers that are all around us. And I think, there is so much violence that is embedded in structures that sometimes we don't even see. And this is true when we engage with grain, as it is in almost everything else that we engage with in our society. And so I think this word healing for me is about, in a really loving way, trying to be able to see the things that have been pushed away and hidden, in order to, when those things are pushed away and hidden, things like white supremacy or colonization that don't get spoken about explicitly, then they can't be changed. And so I think for me, healing, and then specifically about grain, is being able to try to name the story of a seed and the story of land. And then to say, what would it mean for this seed and the community and the relationships around it that it needs to be healthy and whole, understanding that we also need it to be healthy and whole. What would it mean for all those relationships around it to be healed, to be whole? And I think a really important part of asking these questions around healing is not trying to answer them too quickly. Because I think it is about the continued question, the continued dialogue, And that ultimately, I think, is what brings us into relationship and accountability and these ongoing, more democratic processes of the fact that, well, we really do have to come and ask the original stewards of this land before we make a plan about how we're going to heal the wounds and the rupture that maybe I originally saw through climate change, but it's connected to colonization and violence. Or, maybe we really do need to ask people whose labor was stolen before we figure out how we're going to heal the whole history around this crop that is intimately interconnected with that story of stolen labor. So I think, sometimes people say that, talking is somehow like a soft skill, or that storytelling is around the margins of something that needs to happen that's material. But I think, as you've been articulating, that it really is at the center, that the conversations that we have with one another, what we decide is important to us, what we value, is really at the center of all the ways that we do interact materially with each other and with the natural world.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think we're already always in relationship. It's just what kind of relationship? What are the qualities of that? And I think that, healing can be a way of telling these more true stories. And that happens through listening, that happens through a willingness to work. And that happens with sort of persistence, sticking with things. That's perenniality, I guess, in a metaphorical sense, that being able to persist in community and thinking about how those communities are willing to grow and change.
Yeah.
Gals, I'm gonna sneak in here with a little banjo and appreciate you for an amazing dialogue. And thank you, Liz. Thank you, Aubrey.